So I recently watched the first 3 episodes of Keiichi Animation. Without a doubt, the closest thing that we'll ever get to a season 2 proper of the classic comedy masterpiece Nichijou. Not least of all because apparently Kyoto Animation is now only working on projects where they serve as the head of the production committee. Based, but also a big no-no for Nichijou publisher and rights holder Kadokawa Corporation. Ah yes, won't someone please think of the poor megacorporation's profit margins? No! But let's not get lost in a tangent, we'll save that topic for a future video. Keiichi Animation is obviously being produced by Kyoto Animation. It's based on a source material by the same author as Nichijou.
Keiichi Arawi. Yes!
And while Nichijou's Kyoto Animation in-house director Tatsuya Ishihara is not returning for this production, the direction is still being helmed by a familiar name, Keiichi Ishidate, who worked as assistant director on Nichijou. In short, this is clearly the spiritual successor to Nichijou in essentially every right, with one other especially notable exception which we'll talk about later. Now, I love Nichijou's frenetically animated, over-the-top humorous presentations of stupid, mundane, everyday occurrences. I love its serious comedy and its absurd dramatics, all represented by relatively lengthy gag comedy bits, and I love how it's all broken up by these shorter, simpler little liminal breathing moments in between. These relaxing, quiet, painterly little segue animation sequences, all of which are of course supported by a huge array of lovable characters. I own the show on Blu-ray and I've probably watched it start to finish 3 or 4 times at this point, literally rewatching it again for Japanese immersion right now. Which is all to say that I absolutely adore Nichijou and could not have possibly been more excited for quote-unquote Nichijou Season 2. I knew the very moment that I saw the first trailer for Keiichi Animation that we were in for a good time because it has the same vibes, the same art style, the same wonderful music, and I mean, the fact that the trailers themselves already had me about to bust a gut told me everything that I needed to know. Or at least that's how I felt going into the first episode, but then I spent about half of that episode laughing occasionally, but mostly kind of just adjusting to the new vibe and to the realization that Keiichi Animation is in fact not Nichijou Season 2. Similar as it clearly is in so many ways, in many other ways it is very much a different kind of show and a different kind of adaptation even. And so I ended the episode a bit deflated from my own misplaced expectations, much like many commenters I read on certain websites. Comments from other people who were also kind of just expecting Nichijou. But again,
because I'm an idiot. Happy?
But then, about a week later, out of curiosity, I popped the second episode on during my break, and within about 2 minutes thought to myself, yeah, this isn't Nichijou. And I love it. So let's begin, I say, about 2 pages into my script, by talking about some of the similarities and differences, starting with a comparison of the visuals. The art and animation are obviously noticeably similar. This is still a Kyoto Animation production, and it's still an adaptation of the same author's artwork after all. But there are also definitely some clear differences in the general art style and presentation when you compare them side by side, as I have done fairly obsessively while writing this video. Keiichi is a bit more subdued in some ways and much less subdued in other ways. I'd say it exists somewhere in a realm which I would call the uncanny Nichijou Valley. It's still extremely well animated, with arguably just as many insane dynamic camera shots as you would expect from Nichijou's spiritual successor, but these big sweeping dynamic camera shots are certainly used a bit differently here. Usually less about sweeping in or out of the scene or around the subject quickly and dramatically or epically, such as in either of these Nichijou scenes which I'm showing on screen now. Not that there aren't a few short-lived cuts similar to that, but most are more about things like slowly sweeping in to illustrate a large, crowded scene, or slowly rotating to show the full breadth of a three-dimensional space as the big comedy bit reaches its climax, or similarly, the way that it uses independent layers and parallax camera effects to illustrate the surreal beauty of nature, as well as these weird and wacky psychedelic landscapes inside of Izumi's mind. It features the same over-the-top animation techniques as Nichijou, but often applied in very different ways, perhaps a bit more sparse and a bit more subtle. The art and texture of City is extremely minimalistic, cartoonish even, whereas Nichijou often featured painterly backgrounds with that classic hand-brushed gradient aesthetic and somewhat subtle and naturalistic colors. City the Animation's art and textures are minimalistic. One might even go as far as to say super flat, with a handful of cuts consisting entirely of silhouettes, but with often much more highly saturated color palettes than Nichijou. Like, just look at how blue the skies are and how green the grass is here. In short, the color choices are fairly limited and the textures are flat. The foliage and the like in the background often consist entirely of basic outline line art and a few flat colors, each having just 2 or 3 variations to suggest depth and variation between brighter and darker layers. But the colors that are there are highly saturated so that they really pop from one another. Compare that to a similar landscape from Nichijou, and it's much more detailed and gradient-like in texture and color variety, but with much more subdued and naturalistic colors and tones, much like something you might see in a traditional landscape painting or something like that. As well as having relatively flat textures concerning its backgrounds and its landscapes, City also has what the Sakuga bros often refer to as kage nashi style, meaning the shadowless, low detail character animation look. There are exceptions to this shadowless rule for large objects like clouds moving overhead, or when the sunset is casting a dramatic shadow in one direction, creating those halos of light and shadow around character outlines and the like. But you'll notice characters don't cast shadows on their own bodies, even when it makes sense, even when they're moving around. No shadows under their hair, no shadows cast by their clothing, no shadows under noses or necks or between fingers or cast by characters' skirts or the like, as was often the case in Nichijou. You know, you might think the same art style as some episodes from season 2 of Jujutsu Kaisen, as well as a lot of the visuals we've saw from the Chainsaw Man movie coming up. Now, you might be convinced that this was at least mostly the same in Nichijou, but they used heavy, detailed shadows for dramatic comedy scenes quite frequently, whereas City is, once again, essentially super flat in its aesthetic the entire time, with any sense of depth being illustrated by having 2 or 3 different tones of each background color, and in the case of characters, just using a bit of hatched or cross-hatched line art for shadows, movement, and deformations in clothing, for example. And this is true even during the dramatic comedy bits. In Nichijou, there were also tons of examples of normal scenes where we see shadows cast by hair, necks, skirts, hands, and for a more extreme example, just look at Nano here, a regular, non-dramatic scene with the normal standard art style, but with relatively complex shadow work, reflecting the shape of her ki and her clothing. You could also just look at any of the scenes of close-up hands, for example, showing lots of detailed moving shadow work. In short, City's visuals are often more simple and cartoony in both aesthetic and animation sensibilities, but it's simultaneously also far more surreal and one might even say psychedelic for some scenes, and overall is just as dynamic, either way. Whereas Nichijou often bounced between either looking fairly painterly and naturalistic, or basically like a dramatic shonen action show, City the Animation ranges from appearing straight up super flat to cartoonish to occasionally somewhat otherworldly as well. To be fair though, we have also seen at least one quote-unquote combat scene that had straight up impact frames, so maybe that could be a sign of other things to come as well. But on to the comedy sensibilities themselves.
Kept you waiting, huh?
While the humor itself has absolutely grown on me at this point, 4 episodes in now, This, the humor, perhaps more than anything, took some serious adjusting to. It's still absolutely a gag or bit-based comic strip humor type of anime, but it's not nearly as breakneck in its pacing or as balls to the walls bombastically over the top as Nichijou, with its brand of dramatically serious, larger-than-life slapstick comedy, and gags often animated less like comedy scenes and more like traditional shonen action fights. Sometimes you go minutes at a time without getting a gut-busting laugh, just watching characters dick around and relaxing into the vibe instead. And I'm not gonna pretend that I busted out laughing at everything that felt like it was supposed to be a punchline, but I also had multiple moments where I finished a gag, didn't laugh, felt disappointed, and then had that same gag come back like 10 minutes later in the episode, only to be taken completely off guard by the actual punchline. Which is to say that, as everything else in this show is, often the humor is just a bit slower and sometimes just straight up delays the gratitude of the punchline until a few gags later. But when it hits, even when it hits half an episode later when you don't even see it coming anymore, it is very much worth the payoff, in my opinion. Generally speaking, I would just put it like this. If there were a scale, or one might say a spectrum, you know what I'm saying, which runs from pure comedy to purely relaxing Iyashikei healing shows with general slice of life shows in the middle, I'd argue that City the Animation is so far much closer to the Iyashikei or slice of life than the mostly bombastic pure comedy vibe of Nichijou. Or perhaps to dial back the hyperbole just a little bit, whereas Nichijou is comedy with a side of slice of life, City is slice of life with a side of comedy. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You should just go in with that expectation. Go in with an open mind for whatever you personally might end up getting out of this one. It certainly still has some of Nichijou's aesthetics and sense of humor, and the funniest punchlines in the first 5 episodes were still downright hilarious, increasing in their effectiveness on me with each passing episode and each passing week as I acclimate to its art style, its pacing, and its sense of humor, as well as, of course, the new batch of characters and repeating gags and the like. But the show also has a mix of the kind of vibes that you get from shows like Hidamari Sketch, Yuru Camp, Lucky Star, and maybe even stuff like Aria the Animation to a degree. It's still really funny when it's funny, it just also spends just as much of its time simply lulling you into a comfortable, relaxed state. It's just so wholesome, it hurts sometimes.
This whole city is made up of miracles. A city born from the wishes of those who wanted to build it, on a world without water or air. A wonderful miracle.
Basically, you could say that City the Animation has achieved somewhat more of a sense of balance. Whereas Nichijou featured long strings of over-the-top comedy gags broken up by the short, often silent, liminal, relaxing bits that I mentioned earlier, City's sort of comedic rhythm kind of smooths all of this out, with just as many lengthy, relaxing, downbeat slice of life bits as the over-the-top comedy gags, and many long-running bits which delay the gratification of the punchline until much later in the episode, or simply loosen you up, get you relaxed, and then catch you totally off guard when the punchline does finally arrive, even if it's 10 minutes later. The soundtrack is great. It is not, however, being composed by Yuji Nomi, who worked on the soundtrack for Nichijou. It's actually being done by a group called Piranhans, who isn't actually credited for any other anime soundtracks, but whose work you can find on Spotify, YouTube Music, etc. Maybe Keiichi
Arawi.
or the folks at Kyoto Animation were just a fan of this band. There's really no telling with these guys. I don't really know anything about this band personally, to be honest, but the music is kind of like theatrical music arranged for a 4-piece jazz band with an exotic Spanish/Latin flavor to it, question mark. I guess if it reminds me of anything in particular, it's probably all those De Chocobo theme songs from the Final Fantasy series that we've gotten over the years. I don't know. You just gotta listen to it. It sounds goofy and very cartoonish, but it definitely fits the mood of the show really well somehow. And the OP is a freaking bop. Yet another thing that I didn't really enjoy that much the first time I heard it, but now I'm jamming it to and from work, like literally every day. I'm playing it in the background while I fly my drone outside. I love this song now. So if you felt the same, much like the show itself, maybe just give it a second chance. Anyway, as will likely come as little surprise, the basic premise itself is actually little different than Nichijou at its core, outside of the fact that the characters have been bumped up to college age, but let's be honest, that means basically nothing in anime. It all still takes place in a funny, wholesome, laid-back, traditional little traditional little city full of glorious idiots engaging in the high art that is known only as shenanigans. Sometimes hilarious, sometimes awkward, and sometimes just relaxing into the vibe of a simple little city fueled by the tight bonds of its many residents and wholesome vibes with a healthy side of Yuri undertones, if you're looking for them.
Amazing.
A story that has less to do with, well, a story and more to do with the characters themselves and how they all bounce off of each other and this cozy little city that they live in. Speaking of characters, let's just quickly go over the core cast that we've met so far. Our trio of core characters consists of Midori Nagumo, Michael J. Nikura, and Wako Izumi. Nagumo is basically this story's Yuko. She's incredibly athletic but hates responsibility, and perhaps most of all is totally compulsive, for better and for worse. She kinda just follows her heart and trusts her instincts. She hates responsibility being hoisted onto her by others and never fully commits to doing anything that she isn't personally, wholeheartedly bought into, or anything that she thinks she'll make a bunch of money off of or benefit from otherwise. Nikura is basically this story's Mio, and naturally therefore Nagumo's straight man. Perhaps that means that there isn't that much to say about her so far. Basically, she mostly just seems straight-faced.
I'm straight! And I like women! And women only!
As a foil to Nagumo and Izumi's antics. She is very responsible, showcased by the other two kinda just rooming up with her in her apartment and expecting her to mostly take care of things. And she has well-defined personal goals in her university attendance and her love of hobby photography, which she doesn't have that much success with so far, always bested by Izumi, but which she still loves and still tries at.
I'm not very good at it, but it doesn't matter. It's just the fun of doing it that's important.
Also, she has a yellow scooter and big cowgirl boots, so that's pretty cool. As you can no doubt probably guess by now, Izumi is basically this story's Mai, just a little more neurodivergent, let's say. She has a seemingly supernatural ability to produce food or any prop that she needs to engage in her unceasing shenanigans, pranks, calming rituals, adventures, and photography, of course, which she's actually really good at, taking home the #1 prize for City Magazine multiple times, which Nikura, of course, wishes to win with one of her photos, and Nagumo wishes to have the prize money.
We just need money.
And if it's not obvious enough already, she's one of my absolute favorites in this show so far. So let's just quickly talk about this bit where she just goes through all these ridiculous good luck routines and feel-good habits and calming rituals, but hyper dramatic in quick succession with wacky psychedelic visuals and goofy metaphors. She starts frantically digging through her purse for something, but then she gets distracted eating cake. She sniffs some ink and then starts rubbing a shiitake mushroom, but that gets her a little too excited. So she starts playing with eraser putty to calm down, and then she prays to her handmade kami-sama, believes sincerely that it will grant her deepest wishes, and then she immediately stuffs it haphazardly into a tote bag that it clearly does not fit in. Yeah, she might be high on her own fumes, so to speak. And I love it. It's so stupid and it's absolutely hilarious. Now, because of scenes like this, I've heard people complaining about the show just being LOL so random type comedy, but why Nichijou fans are complaining about LOL so random, I will never understand. The only thing I care about is whether it's actually funny or not. If I laugh, it's funny, right? It starts a little slow and it does take some getting adjusted to if you go into it thinking that it's gonna be just more Nichijou, but I promise it does get there eventually, and it's once again funnier with each passing episode, in my opinion. So I would urge you to have a little patience with its sense of comedy. After all, we gotta get used to the new characters and the new gags. It's a new show with new bits, new recurring themes, new recurring gags. is what it is. Anyway, speaking of characters, I was supposed to talk about the other characters, but there's a bakery and a manga publisher and another bakery and some schools, and they're all full of a bunch of other wacky idiots that I'm sure you're gonna love, but I just don't have the time or the remaining attention span to write about, plus this video's too long already. I'm probably already rambling, let's be honest. But I will quickly say it's fun to try and figure out who each one's corresponding supporting character from Nichijou might be, as I've attempted to do so far with the core cast. For example, these two are definitely this show's Sasahara and Misato. Am I right? Or am I right? So yeah, that's pretty cool. But anyway, before I finish the video, I should at least mention episode 5, which I just watched yesterday. There are a few notable things about this episode. First of all, it proves that this series is willing to engage in multi-episode overarching subplots, which is not something I was expecting. Even if they're still mostly for the lulz and for the wholesome vibes and, just character interactions, this was something quite different than the previous episodes, quite different than an episode composed of a handful of mostly self-contained 3 to 4 minute long gag comedy bits. And so as a non-manga reader personally, this was a really interesting surprise and cues me into the fact that this series is one which is willing to throw a total curveball at you and just totally change the formula, at least every once in a while. Also, this is literally just one of the most technically impressive episodes of TV anime I think I've literally ever seen. The second half of this episode, the way that they slowly ramp up the number of ongoing subplots and all these little moving manga style panels outside of the main Tower of Trials plot, which was going on the entire time in the larger panels. Like, there are more panels over time and they grow more complex. As the main plot progressed, we saw more and more perspectives in each new extra panel, each of which grew not less but more complex as the episodes went on, with their own little self-contained wacky adventures, all culminating to the moment when you finally realize that all of those subplots and all of those characters are converging into one location and one event, just as Nagumo escapes the Tower of Trials. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're staring at what feels like literally hundreds of separate full-fledged animations evolving and floating around in these little individual character bubbles that like interact with each other and like bounce into each other as the characters meet and interact. It blew my freaking mind, and I honestly can't imagine the level of forethought, pre-production, coordination, and just passionate work by each individual animator that it must have taken to put this together. Kyoto Animation and the staff working on this season are, as the kids say, goated with the sauce. And I don't even know what that means, but anyway, I just had to mention this episode before I finished the video because honestly, my experience just sitting there, grinning from ear to ear, leaning closer and closer to the TV in utter amazement at what they accomplished here in what is supposed to be just a cool, vibey slice of life show. That alone was worth the price of admission. Anyway, I obviously think that you should check out this show. Just go in with the proper expectations. I wouldn't expect literally Nichijou Season 2 with this having a bit more of a slice of life feel, but if you like shows like Nichijou, as well as shows like Hidamari Sketch, Yuru Camp, Aria the Animation, Lucky Star, Bocchi, K-On!, etc., I think once you acclimatize to the vibes of the city, you too will also find yourself looking forward to each new episode as the weeks go. I certainly am. It's like a wholesome weekly recharge for my mood. It's an upper if ever there was one, and I love it. Anyway, I also wouldn't expect more than 13 episodes, at least for now, since to my knowledge, that's all that's been confirmed for this season, but given that Kyoto Animation is heading the production committee, the fact that Kodansha obviously seems to be fine with that, and that to my understanding from what I've read from Kevin over at Sakuga blog, KyoAni is working relatively close with Keiichi Arawi. Oh, did I pronounced that wrong last time, didn't I? Oh god, have I been pronouncing it wrong the whole time? Oh god, it's Arawi. Okay. And that, to my understanding, KyoAni is working relatively close with Keiichi Arawi on the project. If it's a success, I'd say there is clearly at least a chance for more. And so, with that said, I would actually encourage anyone, ironic for me I know, especially if you already have Amazon Prime anyway, to watch the series on Prime Video. All you gotta do is watch a couple ads, you don't need to pay any extra money. Since KyoAni is heading the production company, they might actually be getting a decent kickback here unlike most other anime under normal circumstances, and it might make a Blu-ray release more likely, which I at least really want. Plus, I gotta say, after finagling with the custom subtitles on Prime Video, and I'll throw my custom settings on screen or whatever. Yes, actual custom format subtitles. I actually found it to be one of the better official viewing experiences that I've had. Not that that's saying much, and yeah, it just feels wrong seeing ads with anime, let's be honest, but I'm dealing with it for this one. But anyway, if you want to support it, that's kind of a no-brainer, but I'm just yapping at this point. Hope that you enjoyed this one, and peace, as always.
Amazing.